All right, I'd like to set up a scenario for you. Imagine you are in need of a serious medical procedure, one that requires you to put your life and your health in the hands of doctors and go under the needle for an unspecified amount of time. You wake up hours later only to realize that they did the wrong procedure on the wrong body part. It's a fear that almost every patient that enters an operating room has, and believe it or not, this is not some urban legend. Medical accidents, things that are like operating on the wrong person or the wrong body part, or even leaving tools inside of a person's body, are called never events. Never because they are preventable errors that should not happen under any circumstances. And yet they do. Take a look at this. According to a new report by the Surgery Journal, objects are left in patients' bodies at least 39 times a week. Doctors perform the wrong procedure on the wrong patient about 20 times a week, and they operate on the wrong body part about 20 times a week as well. So to talk about these disturbing numbers coming out of this report, Peter Provnovost, Senior Vice President of the Patient Safety at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, joins me now. He was one of the researchers who contributed to the study. Welcome, Peter. So how is it that technology and innovation have led doctors to be able to perform miracles like taking a tumor out of a person's brain, but the surgeon can't remember to take all of their utensils with them when they leave?
Well, Megan, you're absolutely right. And for the public, it almost seems incredulous to say, how could we do these brilliant operations that save lives? And most operations go well, and yet many times in a week in the U.S. not comply with some pretty basic stuff. And it's important to realize, Megan, that nobody wants this to happen. The doctors and nurses, the administrators work very hard, but they happen, I think, in part because of a still often toxic safety culture, and because we're not using technologies to help prevent this.
And the report that you contributed to estimated that 80,000 of these so-called never events have happened over the past 2 decades. And that's a low estimate on what the report says is actually going on. So explain how you came upon this data and why you think the real number could actually be a lot higher.
Well, you're right, Megan. The database that we use to find these is called the National Practitioner Database. And it's a database of liability claims, malpractice claims in the United States. But what's important to recognize is not all of these never events actually lead to a claim. Indeed, the minority probably do. There's some estimates that only 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 claims or events go to, and not every claim is actually submitted to this database. So these numbers are likely a significant underestimate of how often they're happening. So what we know is, despite a lot of effort, it's been devilishly to try to reduce these, and we really have to refocus our efforts.
I do have to ask you, Peter, given the number of surgeries that are performed each year, is this problem really as big as it sounds, or is it a little bit more than it sounds? I mean, are we overestimating this seriousness?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. The vast majority of operations go without any of these never events happening. That most patients, indeed fewer than 1%, go on without having a sponge left in or operating on the wrong side of the body. And so in absolute percentages, it's small. But for you or the public or your mother, small isn't good enough. If you have operated on the wrong side of the body or have the wrong procedure, it's tragic. And we have to really make sure we work that never happens again. And there's many things that patients can get engaged in to try to help prevent this.
And it's not necessarily scalpels that are being left in a person's body. As you mentioned, it's sponges. It's things like this. This is obviously not exactly a medical sponge. But the number one thing that is being left in a patient's body is a sponge. The number 2 and 3 thing is multiple sponges. So talk about the impacts that leaving something in a person's body and what it actually does.
Well, many of these things, we'll find them when the patient comes back either complaining of some persistent pain or has some signs of infections. And often on further follow-up, we find out that indeed there was this sponge left, and the care team would go back in and try and remove the sponge. It's generally not difficult to take it out, but as you can imagine, the fear and the anxiety, the often long period of having pain or infections, and then the reoperations are all quite concerning to patients.
So let me ask you, Peter, when a patient enters the operating room, they're forced to trust the doctor that is performing the surgery on them. I mean, is there really any way that a patient can protect themselves from becoming a victim of this medical malpractice?
Yeah, there's a number of things they can do. One is when they come into the hospital for surgery, before they're asleep, when they're waiting to go into the operating room, they could do a number of things. One, they should be really clear that they know what operation they're having and what part of their body they're being operated on. Two is they should make sure that the consent form that they sign, stating what they're giving permission to do to them, exactly matches what they believe in their mind or they have written elsewhere is the operation. And three, they should make sure that the doctor actually marks the site of where this operation is supposed to happen. So if it's my right knee or my left shoulder, that there's actually a marking so that they go in to do that. And those are some strategies to prevent having the wrong operation or the wrong part of your body operated on.
And Peter, let's go ahead and talk about what the hospitals could do to protect these patients. What are the solutions the hospitals can take, something like checklists or increasing communication, things like that?
You're absolutely right. So hospitals are using checklists, and they're required by the Joint Commission, but as you can see by these data, they haven't been particularly effective yet in these. In part, that might mean that they're done, but they're what we call ritualized compliance, that the checklist is just being checked, but the people aren't really focused or paying attention. And so we need to do a couple things. One is work on improving a safety culture. And what I mean by that is a culture where people are focused on keeping patients safe. They're comfortable speaking up and questioning each other. And too often, doctors and nurses each other. And some other research we did, we found that in 90% of bad events that patients happen, these significant errors, somebody knew something was wrong, but either didn't speak up, presumably because they got yelled, or they spoke up and they were ignored. And that's just too high of a price to pay for poor teamwork and culture.
And Peter, the study also found that 62% of the surgeons that had performed one of these never events were cited more than once on separate malpractice reports. I mean, what is being done about those doctors, and how can a patient ensure that they won't have the wrong person working on them?
Well, Rachel, you're absolutely right. What we see is the vast majority of physicians perform excellent care, but there are some physicians who seem to cluster with these events, that they might seem to have a pattern of having more complaints than others, having more malpractice claims than others, and that might be a sign of poor quality, a sign of random error. But what consumers should do is a number of things. One, make sure that their doctor is board certified. It's not a perfect check, but it's relatively easy to check. Most states in the United States, many countries, have websites that you can look up to see if your doctor is board certified. And you could always ask them. Two is you can look up if they have significant complaints about that doctor. That's often through state licensing boards in the United States or similar things internationally. And they can look up if there's a database of malpractice claims, such as this one.
It sounds like a lot of work, but hopefully, go ahead.
Megan, perhaps most importantly is also they should make sure that the doctor does what they're going to do frequently. That for most procedures, there is a volume outcome relationship. And in other words, what we mean is that the doctors who do more of these tend to do better. Indeed, just last week, Megan, I was caring for a patient in the intensive care unit that had an esophageal operation that went terribly wrong. And the hospital that she had it done at, it wasn't at Johns Hopkins, she was transferred into Johns Hopkins, had done one of those the last year. And Johns Hopkins did over 100. And I asked her, as she spoke through a breathing tube, did the hospital or the doctor tell her that they only had performed one, and she was taking a greatly enhanced risk by not going to a hospital that does more of these. And she said no. She never knew she was at increased risk. And so finding out, is this something that the hospital does often, is a really, really important thing.
That's a very interesting story and a very interesting point, Peter. Obviously, you can only trust the people that whose hands you put your life in. And we appreciate you coming on and talking about the study and the research that you did. That was Peter Pronovost, Senior Vice President of Patient Safety at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine.